Hi, I'm Richard Nimogene from the School of Canadian Studies, and I'm here with Dr. Andre Loiselle from the Department of Film Studies at Carleton, and Andre has agreed to answer some questions for our course called Interfaces Between English and French Canadian Cultures, and he's going to speak to us a little bit about film in Canada, about language relations, the difference between Quebec cinema and English Canadian cinema, and how this helps us understand Canada as an officially bilingual country. So Andre, thanks for coming for this interview. In the course, we've talked a lot about how part of Canada's disunity as a country is related to the failure historically to develop institutions and symbols that linked English and French Canadians early on, and there was a promise that Canada would be a binational country. Culture is another part of this equation that we want to think about in the course, and so I'm wondering, in terms of Canadian cinema, if that trend is also something that's evident.
Originally, there was an attempt at creating a bilingual cinema, if you will, in Canada through the National Film Board of Canada. The National Film Board moved to Montreal in 1956, and that was specifically, it was in Ottawa before, and it moved to Montreal specifically to try to emphasize the bilingualness of the institution. And for a few years there was an attempt to really merge the English-Canadian and French-Canadian traditions and have French-Canadian, English-Canadian filmmakers working together in Montreal. But even if there were a few signs that it could work, it ultimately failed. Not that the NFB failed, but this attempt to have a genuine bilingual cinema did not quite work. Very quickly, French-Canadian filmmakers started focusing on French-Canadian culture, and English-Canadian filmmakers, as a matter of fact, became much more international to a certain extent, much more multicultural, but moving away a little bit from this idea of bilingualism. And one could argue that since the 1960s, in spite of some vague attempts at bilingualism in cinema, it's been really the two solitudes in Canadian cinema. On the one hand, French-Canadian culture, on the other hand, more diffuse English-Canadian attempt at being multicultural, at being international, and at being typical English-Canadians, basically.
So we can think about English-Canadian and French-Canadian cinema, and then we would have French-Canadian cinema and Quebec cinema.
Mm-hmm.
Are those, is there a difference on within the French language tradition?
Not much, because Quebec has been quite successful in creating a francophone cinema. Whatever attempts at a francophone cinema outside of Quebec have generally been swallowed up by Quebec. For instance, there's a good example, Rodrigue Jean, who's a New Brunswick filmmaker, Acadian filmmaker, who actually made quite a few successful films in Acadia. Full Blast is probably his best known film. It was quite successful, but very quickly he realized, I guess, that in order to make French language cinema, he basically had to be in Montreal. So his more recent films, like he has a very nice documentary called Homme à Vendre on male prostitution, that was made basically in Montreal, and his career over the last few years has been in Quebec. And that's relatively typical, a few outbursts here and there of francophone cinema outside Quebec, but very quickly sort of absorbed by a relatively large industry that has been quite successful, but that is centralized in Montreal.
Okay. As an observer of film, someone who watches films, it seems to me that Quebec cinema has been quite successful, both in terms of box office and critically. Whereas English Canadian cinema, there are obviously some very good films, but many people don't see them. One of your colleagues talks about absence as sort of one of the themes. Why is Quebec so successful and English Canadian cinema less so?
It's a difficult question, obviously, and there's a wide range of answers, but the most obvious one is actually language. Historically, Quebec cinema or French Canadian cinema has emerged and has been successful because French has served as a buffer between Hollywood and the audience in Quebec. While in English Canada, Hollywood, well, it's very well known that Canada is actually considered to be a domestic market for Hollywood. So when they talk about domestic gross, they totally include Canada within that domestic gross. So Hollywood considers Canada to be a domestic market precisely because Hollywood films can move so easily throughout Canada that there's really no distinction between American cinema and English Canadian cinema to a certain extent. In Quebec, it's always been somewhat different, of course, because initially Hollywood films, in order to be accessible to a French-speaking audience, had to go through France to be dubbed and then make it to Quebec. Eventually, the French intermediary was removed and the film started being dubbed in Quebec. But even then, this dubbing industry actually helped Quebec industry quite a bit because actors would actually make a living dubbing Hollywood films. Parallel to this, there's been, of course, the emergence of a homegrown Quebec cinema that very, very quickly started attracting large audiences because people in Quebec wanted to see their own stories. They wanted to see it in their own language, and the historical value of radio is also quite important. Radio emerging in the 30s and 40s created an audience that wanted to hear its own stories. And when cinema and television took over in the 50s and 60s, this same demand for our own stories in French continued. And certainly since the 60s, Quebec cinema, with ups and downs, has managed to be quite successful precisely because it has this homogeneous, almost homogeneous audience that's more than willing to hear and see its own stories with its own stars in its own landscape, something that never quite developed in English Canada.
In our course, we're watching the film Bon Cop, Bad Cop as an example of a film that speaks both languages, literally. And what strikes me is that it seems to be rather rare in Canadian cinema, something that operates as a bilingual film. I'm wondering if there were earlier examples of this type of film, and what this says about Canada or Canadian cinema, the lack of such films.
It is quite rare, and as a matter of fact, when it came out in 2008, 2009, one of its achievements was that it was the first truly bilingual film in Canada. Not entirely true, but the fact that they managed to attract an audience on the basis of this rarity of being a bilingual film speaks volumes that this is actually quite rare. There has been a few previous examples of bilingual films. A film that I quite like called The Pix, a little horror film that was shot in Montreal primarily in English, but almost 50-50 with a lot of French, and that dates back to 1973. But again, those are very rare cases, and it's probably because bilingualism has not been genuinely integrated in Canadian culture. Except for a few pockets. Montreal, one could say this is a truly bilingual city. Ottawa is somewhat bilingual as well. But other than a couple of examples like this, there's very few places where bilingualism is actually a reality, and it simply has not been reflected in film. There are quite a few films that have snippets of the other language. There's a film called Picturing Claire by Bruce MacDonald, a Toronto filmmaker, that has quite a bit of French. There's another film called Deux Frogs dans l'Ouest, which is a relatively recent film, and it's, as you can tell, a couple of French Canadians going to BC to find themselves. But in those films, the other language is more used for the sake of exoticism. Isn't it quaint to have someone who speaks French, or isn't it quaint to have someone who speaks English in an otherwise French film? And those are fun, and there's been a number of those, but the two languages are not genuinely integrated with one another. One is always the dominant language, and it's not always English. Very often in a French-Canadian film, French will be the dominant language with snippets of English just to sort of pay lip service to the other side of the river, I guess, and for the sake of jokes and things like that, but it's not fully integrated as it is in Bon Cop, Bad Cop.
So there's a reflection of broader Canadian tendencies. Perhaps finally, one of your other areas of specialty is horror films, slasher films, and the students were reading one of your articles on this. And I'm wondering if, again, there's a difference between Quebec cinema in this genre and English Canadian genre, and if it reflects the broader patterns that we've talked about.
There are minor differences. One of the dominant topic of the Quebec horror film is religion, obviously, which is not surprising because Catholicism has had great influence in Quebec culture, so it's not surprising then that horror films would deal with that aspect of culture a little bit more. But again, there's a lot of religious themes in all sorts of horror films, made in Hollywood, made in English Canada, made around the world, so it's not a huge distinction. What is really quite different about the Quebec horror film is that it is a very, very recent phenomenon. In English Canada, there has been horror films for 100 years, as a matter of fact. The first horror film was called The Wolfman back in 1913. But in French Canada, traditionally, there's been very, very few genres. There's been auteur films that have been critically acclaimed, and then in terms of popular cinema, it's been primarily the comedy. The comedy has dominated Quebec cinema for at least 50 years, but other genres have not had the same success until quite recently. And horror especially has emerged only over the last decade, really, in French Canada. And the horror films that we see in French Canada, other than being in French and being shot in Montreal, are not significantly different from horror films that we'd see from English Canada or from anywhere else around the world. But what is of interest to me is that for the first 70 years of its history, Quebec cinema had very little interest or no ability to make horror films, it seems. But recently, because the industry has become very healthy, it has become very popular, very, very critically acclaimed with Oscar nominations left and right, there is now this, this courage, it seems, among French-Canadian filmmakers to break out with the traditional either auteur cinema or comedy and try other things. So now what we have are a number of historical films, a number of thrillers, a number of cop movies such as Bon Cop, Bad Cop, and lately horror films. And all of those have been quite successful and demonstrate that the Quebec audience is open to anything that filmmakers will try to make in Quebec, as long as it has this element of distinctiveness. French-Canadian spectators really like to see their own stars, their own locations, and hear their own language in films. Whatever the genre is, they're fine with it, as long as they feel that they are being represented.
And one other thing that just came to mind is, I know you've done work on Denis Arcand, and here's an interesting character who's gone both through the National Film Board, but who has international appeal and who started working in English throughout his career. Is that something remarkable, or just because of his success?
Yeah, it's relatively uncommon, but it does happen relatively regularly that when a French-Canadian filmmaker has some success, like Denis Arcand, or before him, Claude Jutras, for instance, then the other side will try to attract them. And as much as Quebec has been very, very successful at home and has been quite successful critically in film festivals, Quebec remains quite a small market, 7 million people. So a filmmaker who has managed to be quite successful in that small province very often will try to reach a much broader audience by working in English. Because even if English-Canadian filmmakers on the face of it tend to have been less successful at home, they tend to be quite successful abroad. David Cronenberg, very often not recognized as a Canadian filmmaker, but working in Toronto, fully Canadian, has been very, very successful internationally. And as much as Denis Arcand is incredibly well known at home, has had the Oscar and prizes at Cannes and all that, his audience remains pretty small. So the temptation to work in English is very strong, and he's made a couple of films. Stardom has been quite successful internationally. His other films, Love and Human Remains, has not been that successful, but even then, a small success in English is sometimes financially better than a big success in French, because the audience is so small for French-Canadian film.
Which again parallels issues in Canadian studies, where often we look to the United States for our success. Andre, I'd like to thank you for sharing your thoughts on these questions of cinema. And again, it's a reminder that Canadian studies as an interdisciplinary field gives us all sorts of insights from a variety of disciplines to help understand the Canadian condition. So thanks very much, Andre.
You're welcome.